sample taken by Travis Audacity. To be pretty sure they don't really know what he's talking about.
I'm Laura London, and this is a special quarantine edition of Speaking of Jung. Joining us for episode 19.5 in this series is award-winning science writer and host of The Other Side of Midnight, the legendary Richard C. Hoagland, in the high desert of New Mexico. He is a science writer and consultant in the fields of astronomy, planetarium curating, and space program education. In 1965, at the age of 19, he became curator of the Springfield Science Museum in Springfield, Massachusetts. The following year, he served as NBC Television consultant for the historic soft landing of a U.S. spacecraft on the moon and appeared on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. During the Apollo 8 lunar-orbital mission on Christmas of 1968, he was asked to become a consultant to CBS News and served for many years as science advisor to Walter Cronkite. Together with Carl Sagan, Mr. Hoagland co-created the Pioneer Plaque and predicted life on Europa in his groundbreaking paper, The Europa Proposal, published 37 years before NASA's announcement. He served for 10 years as a consultant for the NASA Goddard Space Flight Center, contributing documentation on the Orbiting Astronomical Observatory project. For the last several decades, he has led an outside scientific team in a critically acclaimed independent analysis of possible intelligently designed artifacts on the Viking images of Mars. In 1993, he was awarded the International Angstrom Medal for Excellence in Science for his research. Mr. Hoagland appeared regularly as the science advisor on Coast to Coast AM with Art Bell and later with George Norrie, and co-produced the radio program The Night of the Encounter on WTIC-AM in Hartford, Connecticut, which covered the July 14, 1965 Mariner 4 flyby of the planet Mars. He is the author of The Monuments of Mars, A City on the Edge of Forever, published in 1987, and co-author with Mike Barra of Dark Mission, The Secret History of NASA, which reached the New York Times bestsellers list in 2007. Currently, he serves as principal investigator of the Enterprise mission, which he founded in 1992, and is the creator and host of the late-night weekend radio show The Other Side of Midnight, airing Saturday and Sunday nights at midnight Eastern. Please visit the website speakingofjung.com, where you will find links to everything discussed in this episode in the show notes. This interview is being recorded on Friday, June 4th, 2021, through the magic of Skype. Hi, Richard.
Hi, Laura.
Hi.
How did you find that stuff about NBC?
Well, I didn't know that stuff about NBC. So
that was so amazing because, well, I was still in high school, I think. I have to think back, and and we had a vacation. Schools used to have kind of planned vacation periods. Mm-hmm. So a friend of mine and I decided, because I was in Springfield, Massachusetts, we decided that we would take a trip to New York, which was like 3 or 4 hours just driving south. So we got on the highway and drove to New York, and we're kind of palling around. And I had a friend of mine at NBC, Peter Hackus, who was the space correspondent that I had been in touch with. In those days, the only way to talk to someone was by phone or letter. Remember letters?
Yes.
Physical thingies with pens and ink and, blobby shirts and all. Anyway, so I wanted to show my friend Bruce NBC, because I kind of snuck in there when I was in high school. I would go to New York, randomly, occasionally, and I would wear a suit and I'd carry a briefcase, and I was at that time 16 or 17, and I would literally just go up to Studio 8H with a briefcase, get in the elevator, go up, and sit there while they taped the Huntley and Brinkley nightly television show. And no one questioned me. No one stopped me. If you look like you know where you're going in life, few people will stop you. That was a very early lesson that was extracurricular outside of school. It has stood me in good stead in many, many cases since. So I just kind of wanted to show my friend, where I would hang out when I went to New York. And I'm trying to think back now, kind of here in real time. So we went to, to kind of, I wanted to show him that studio. And we went up in the elevators and we debauched in like the little lobby and then walked across the hall to Studio 8H. It's a very famous NBC studio. All kinds of historic things have been done out of 8H. And they were preparing to cover live that night the first unmanned landing of Surveyor 1 on the moon. This was like June 1st, June 2nd of 1966, a date that will live in not infamy, but, fame. Anyway, so, we're kind of standing there in the corner, and there's technicians running around, and there's saws, and there's, they're basically building a set. And the guy who was going to anchor was a very famous television personality in New York at that time for Channel 4 named Frank Field. He was the NBC meteorologist. He was on the Today Show. He did, local NBC affiliate, which was Channel 4. And so we're kind of just trying to be as unobtrusive and not get in the way. And I'm watching these burly technicians manhandling a huge globe of the moon. Mm-hmm. Actually, it wasn't a full globe. It was a half globe because, of course, you can't see the other side. So all they needed for television was the side you can see. Yeah. So it was made by, I think it was the Geographic had commissioned, National Geographic magazine and the Society had commissioned models, three-dimensional models for museums of of the moon and of the Earth, and they had cast them in, I forget what kind of lustrous plastic with all the colors and everything basically embedded in the plastic. So they were incredibly realistic, and this was network television. So they somehow probably bought it for several, in those days, tens of thousands of dollars, and they were hanging it up to be behind Frank as the cameras, were working the set, and he was talking about Surveyor landing on the moon. And I'm kind of intrigued because my background was simultaneous while I was in high school. I was also at the museum in Springfield, and that's how I became the curator of astronomy and space science at the very, very tender age of it might have been 19.5. I got to go back and check
sure
that.
It was. It had to have been.
Isn't that kind of, yeah, it's kind of weird. Anyway, so we're, my friend Bruce, I think he'd come with me when I'd done a couple of local television shows on Proven Mountain, which was I think it was an NBC affiliate 10 miles west of Springfield, Massachusetts, where I would do, as part of my job at the museum, I basically opened up a whole, this is television in the era of NASA and space and all that. So I had dragged him up there a couple of times. So he was familiar with how television behind the scenes worked. Because in those days, it was all magic. It was all, we're talking Leave It to Beaver time. Come on. Yeah. So people were enthralled with television and the magic of behind the scenes. Jack Parr was had just quit, and Johnny Carson had taken over the Tonight Show. So it was all really new. So for him, this was a real treat to kind of see, how networks as opposed to local stations, did this stuff. So we're standing there, we're watching, and I'm watching these guys hauling up this huge plastic hollow front side of the moon to hang behind Frank Fields in the shot. And I said to myself, uh-oh. And Bruce said, what? I said, they're hanging the moon upside down. So being so shy and retiring and reticent, I went over to, I forget who I went over to, and I said, guys, you're hanging the moon upside down. And it turned out to be Frank Field. He turned around and he said, what? So I explained who I was. I was this curator from this museum in Springfield, Massachusetts. Didn't mention I was still in high school. And I said, I work with this stuff, and you're hanging the moon upside down. So suddenly everything stops. And, remember, because in those days, everything was unionized. You couldn't pick up a pen on the set without, my first time with Cronkite, I had this, I looked like Halley's Comet, because instead of taking all my stuff to brief Cronkite on the set, I had to walk on, and they all had to carry the stuff behind me, guy after guy after guy, with papers and photographs and whatever. I looked like Halley's Comet, winding my way between the cameras. And this is years later. Anyway, so welcome to network unionized television, workers. So anyway, so it was one of those situations where, you've seen the movie where someone says the king is dead, and then another hero says louder, the king is dead. And then three people say, the king is dead. Well, this wave propagated because this kid standing in the corner of the set says they're hanging the moon upside down. Charlie, the moon's upside down. What? Charlie, you got to turn the moon upside down. Charlie, it's upside, turn it. This went on for like an hour. And finally, it got turned right side up. And then Field came over to me and he said, how would you like to be a consultant tonight when we land on the moon? And that was the beginning of my network career in network television.
I love it. I love it. So that led to you working with Walter Cronkite.
Yeah, many years later, maybe 66, this would be now 2 years later, 68. Toward the end of the year, they were coming up to Apollo 8, which was going to break with all traditions. And there's a long backstory, and my clock says 19.5 as I'm going through this. Which I won't go into because we don't have time. It's only a 2-hour show, right?
Right.
So the thing was, I got a phone call at the museum. I think I was at the museum. Yeah, I was at the museum, and it was from New York, and the switchboard operator had put it through. And they had called for Mr. Hoagland. Nobody called me Mr. Hoagland in Springfield in those days. Anyway, so. I picked up the phone, and there was a guy at the other end, and he said, hi, my name is Frank Manitsis. I am associate producer with CBS News Special Events. We'd like you to help us go to the moon. And, it's out of favor now, but remember that old Bill Cosby line where God talks to him at the top of a very steep hill in San Francisco? I
don't know that one.
God says, Bill... And he says, what? Bill? He says, who is this? This is God. And Crosby says, back in the days when we all liked Cosby, who is this really? So that was my reaction.
Right. Okay, right.
Frank Manitsis, CBS, who is this really?
Mm-hmm.
And it turned out to be totally for real. I made the appointment to drive to New York and be wined and dined at the CBS headquarters, studios there on West 57th Street.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the beginning of an extraordinary, it's kind of like that line out of Casablanca, a beautiful friendship, because I had all kinds of adventures with CBS and Cronkite and, borrowing ocean liners and trying to rendezvous with, paper boats in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean during the Apollo mission landing on the moon. All kinds of amazing stuff happened because this guy called me and said, I'm Frank Manitsis. Would you like to help us go to the moon?
Mm-hmm. And that was during the Apollo 8 mission, which was in 1968?
No. This was before.
Before.
It was supposed to leave in December. It was literally the Christmas week launch. And they spent Christmas and Christmas Eve and Christmas orbiting the moon. Remember that?
Oh, yeah.
So this was like in October.
Okay.
And I'd been knowing this was happening, and I'd been thinking that I should, probably try to do something beyond just the museum. And I was looking at Channel 5, which in those days it was WTTG out of New York. It was a kind of a private channel that was at network level caliber. And that was before Fox. That was before Fox took over all. But, again, in a couple, 3 days, the phone rang, and there it was, CBS, and it was the beginning of an extraordinary set of adventures.
So now Apollo 8 wasn't originally scheduled to orbit the moon, was it? That was kind of a last minute thing. And that was our first time actually going to the moon. We didn't land, but it was in preparation for the landing a year later.
Yeah, it was all kind of out of sync because, for those that have now kind of grown up on the space program, you know how incredibly complicated and cantankerous various things are. And when you're trying to, produce several different sets of spacecraft and rockets that all have to work together like this extraordinarily expensive orchestra, sometimes certain parts of the system are not ready when other parts of the system are. And this was a problem because they had planned, I think, on Apollo 8, the original had been to fly the lunar module, which was made in a company called Grumman Aircraft out on Long Island, in a place called Bethpage. And the lunar module, the LM, was not ready. Mm-hmm. So the Russians were very aggressive. They had just sent several unmanned spacecraft looping around the moon, returning to the Earth, entering the atmosphere, landing in the ocean, being picked up, and relaying imagery because they'd taken automatic cameras to photograph the moon. And we all thought, given that there was this huge rocket that was on the pad in the Soviet Union, the N-1, that they were going to try to beat Kennedy's goal of being the first on the moon. So people were very despondent at NASA because the lunar module was not ready. So in one of the most imaginative and totally unexpected, non-bureaucratic reactions of any government agency that I can ever, think of now in history, the upper echelons at NASA decided to take the Apollo 8 mission, which was supposed to be a high looping orbit around the Earth, maybe out to 20, 30,000 miles in a big long loop to test docking procedures and the lunar module and all that in Earth orbit. And they decided to send the Apollo 8 mission out of Earth orbit into lunar orbit without a lunar module, spending, I think, 10 orbits. And each orbit around the moon is about 2 hours, if I remember correctly. Height, altitude, gravity, all that. And that would have been this stunning, at the moon, basically to blunt the propaganda win if the Russians really did pull off what we thought from a variety of sources they were going to try to do, which is their own mission, lunar mission, to upstage Kennedy's goal, his dream. And so they repurposed Apollo 8 without a lunar module to leave Earth orbit and go to the moon, or orbit it 10 times and then come back and splash down the Pacific and, become the first modern humans. Of course, in those days, I didn't think in those terms. Now, of course, I have a much different view of our ancient past in the solar system and who we really are and what we've really done and how our history has been kind of suppressed for reasons we can get into. It's only a 2-hour show, so there's not enough time to do it all. Anyway, so this was a big deal. Remember when Biden turned to Obama during the healthcare thingy, and he said in a stage whisper, "This is a big blankety blank deal." Well, Apollo 8 was a big deal because remember, we had come off just a few years before in '67 the Apollo fire, which had killed 3 human beings.
3, yeah. The crew. Mm-hmm.
And that had been such a shock both for the agency and for the country that within like a year plus, because we're now talking 68, it would have been January 67, right. January 68, December 68, within like less than 2 years, we're ready to go and do something that humans have, according to our history then, never done, which is go to the moon. And that's why this phone call was so amazing, because somebody at CBS wanted me to be part of history. And it was one of those, pinch me. Am I dreaming, or is this all for real? Mm-hmm. And it was real.
It was real. And you stayed during the subsequent Apollo missions as well. And you weren't just in the studio in New York. You were actually at the Cape.
They sent us to the Cape. They sent us to California to do, because during Apollo 11, which was, of course, July of 1969, it's amazing what happened between, December of 1968 and July of 1969. So much incredible telescoped history. An awful lot of things happen. I got to meet an awful lot of people. It's amazing where you can get into when you pick up the phone and say, "Hi, my name is, Dick Hoagland from CBS News." Doors fly open. People want to tell you their life stories. They open files. It was so heady to be. I think I was 20, 22, 23 at that time, and it was like literally. The first time I was in the control room, I sat, kind of like remember the bridge set in Star Trek, the captain's chair, and then that was kind of like the arrangement in the control room at CBS.
Okay.
And I sat kind of like where Spock would have sat to, speak with Kirk over his shoulder. Mm-hmm. Except instead of Kirk, we had our executive producer, Robert Wussler, and he was kind of in the center of these rows and rows of people looking at screens and monitors and all that, because it took, like, I counted them one day, 45 television monitors in the control room alone to keep us on the air, to keep the CBS News television network on the air all over the world. We were just beginning the era of satellites and all that, and we had downrange cameras on aircraft carriers and linked back through things like SYNCOM and Intelsat, early communications satellite experiments from NASA. Anyway, it was an incredibly heady time to be part of all of that and to be covering humankind leaving the cradle. In those days, I thought it was for the first time. Turns out it wasn't. But I was kind of like a missionary because I was on this mission to get people to see the big, big, big picture. And they were all looking at this as Kennedy's, dying stunt to outdo the Russians. I mean, the lack of vision that I found at all different levels of a network in those days was, frankly, very appalling. And so I can honestly say that because I was such a, burr under the saddle blanket, I made a difference. I made them do things they would never have wanted to do or thought of doing without me there. So I obviously pulled my weight, and I, made friends. I made enemies. There was one woman producer. In those days, women producers were very rare, and she somehow saw me as a rival, which, when you compound the, equal, rights thing with, job security, with power of being a producer at a major, it was one of those things I never resolved as to why she kind of took this instant dislike to me. But it was not all clear sailing. Let me just say that.
Oh, I'm sure it wasn't.
It was every big organization has pecking orders and levels and countercurrents and soap opera and water cooler talk. And anyway, I learned so much that would prepare me for what I'm now doing, which is trying to get our current civilization to realize that we are not the first, that, we've trekked this pathway many, many, many years before, thousands of years, maybe millions of years. And we are kind of looking back at our extraordinary history, which for some reason, nobody seems to want to tell us about. And I, prepared myself to deal in this level of, high political and communications chicanery by my stint there at CBS News.
Your stint at CBS News, and after the Apollo missions to the moon, which ended, I believe, in 1971 with Apollo 17, where did you go from there? How did you become interested in Mars?
Well, I actually had a couple of hats in those days, because remember, I was also a NASA consultant. I was formerly on the payroll at NASA through the Goddard Space Flight Center during this period of time. And so it was kind of a co-equal thingy. I remember one meeting in New York at CBS, which ultimately wound up attaching me formally to the Apollo program itself. So I can say with absolute bona fides that I had a tiny, tiny contribution physically to our landing on the moon, not just covering it, not just, advising Cronkite and the network. I worked on Apollo, and I'll tell you how it happened. The head of Grumman, remember Grumman made the lunar module, and of course they were very embarrassed that they weren't ready for Apollo 8, and they were doing all kinds of outreach things to kind of make up for it. So I remember that the head of public affairs for Grumman was at the bureau, CBS, one afternoon, and I'm trying to remember his name. Is Dick, what was his last name? Anyway, it'll come to me, hopefully during the show. He was there for a meeting, because we were going to have to go out to Bethpage, take a unit out there, set up a remote. In those days when you were in the field and broadcasting back to New York, it was called a remote. And I, wound up getting into conversation with him. And I did my usual thing, this is the greatest thing since sliced bread, and we're leaving the cradle and all that. And he said to me, how would you like to write the lunar section of the Grumman Press book on the lunar module for us?
Oh. And
I said, what? He says, yeah. He says, we need somebody who knows the moon and knows all this stuff, and we want a thorough, where we're going, what the science is, what the dream might be. He said, you're obviously the perfect guy. And bingo, there I was, part of the Apollo program officially through Grumman on Long Island that built the spacecraft that landed Neil and Buzz on the moon. And it was later nominated for an Aviation and Space Writers Award as Best Science Writing of 1969. Now, I didn't win because my competition, remember the Oscar thing where they say, well, it's not really winning, it's being nominated? It's real. I was so thrilled to be in that. Come on, I'm in my early, I'm not, dry behind the ears. I'm 23. And I'm in the league of all these incredible veteran journalists and science folks and all that. Nominated for an Aviation Space Writers Award in those days meant you had joined the club. And many, many years later, like 2 or 3 years ago, I actually found this thing online. And, you hate reading your old stuff.
Oh, you found the document online?
Oh, yeah. It is part of a PhD thesis by a scientist at the University of Maryland who has done this incredible comprehensive history of the Apollo program. And there I am in lights for both my work with CBS and Cronkite, as well as they actually published in this thesis, which is in, I guess, the University of Maryland now, library and on the internet. You can actually find it. If you Google Grumman, lunar module, Hoagland, and think of a couple of other identifiers, you can find it because it's on the Grumman Bethpage website, the actual company, and I actually dared to read it. This was like 2 or 3 years ago.
No, I will find it and provide a link to it in the show notes.
And it held up.
It held up.
I couldn't, because I literally typed it. I remember exactly where I was when I was writing it. And I'd borrowed my mom's IBM Selectric typewriter. And in those days, of course, there was no such things as digital copying, so you had to put a carbon in.
Right.
If you wanted to copy your manuscript, you had to put a carbon. So I remember tactily that Selectric typewriter, the little bouncing ball that went back and forth, radical advance. Space age advance in electric typewriters for 1969 as we're landing on the moon. And so that was the typewriter I typed it on, and it wound up in the press book, and people read it all over the world. And it's my encapsulation of why the hell Apollo was important. Like a lot of the folks I worked with at CBS never got it. But ultimately, I got to put it down in print,
Mm-hmm.
and people all over the planet will be reading forever, going back to the time when man went to the moon, and this nobody named Hoagland wrote about for the official lunar landing spacecraft why it was important.
I have a question that I never understood. Why did the Russians just kind of stop what they were doing and not pursue going too? Just because we had already gone?
Well, that's a very long and complicated
Okay.
story, and as
I'm
you know,
sure.
I like to document controversial things. It's controversial. They had put together this incredibly complicated spacecraft rocket combination called the
Yeah.
N1, which had hundreds of rocket engines. Remember, the Saturn V had 5
Yes.
F1 engines, each one with 1.5 million pounds of thrust. Well, the Russians in those days could not build big, complicated rocket engines that had the thrust.
Okay.
So they had to gang, as the term is called, a bunch of smaller engines together. And the problems were so insurmountable for the technology
Mm-hmm.
of the era, controlled technology. When Elon Musk chose to do the same thing with his rockets, the heavy Falcon Heavy,
Uh-huh.
and the Falcon itself, and now his Starship with the super heavy booster, he has dozens and dozens of Merlin engines, as they're called. The rocket has a name, and they all said to him, "Elon, it'll never work because it'll do the same thing the Russians did. It'll blow up because if the thrust. Remember, rockets only work because you're burning something in a chamber. It's kind of like an internal combustion engine, except it's not internal. One end of the chamber is open and to space, to a vacuum, and that's what creates the unbalanced thrust, and that's what creates velocity. So a rocket engine is basically an unbounded, car engine with the cylinders open to space. And everybody knows that if you have like 8 or 12 cylinders, if you don't do certain things correctly, you'll get what's called engine knock.
Mm-hmm.
Well, in rockets, that knock develops so dramatically and has such force that it literally blows things up. So they had engine knock between all the engines on the Soviet N1 booster.
Okay.
And so they could never get them synchronized, so they all were, purring smoothly,
Mm-hmm.
bringing in the obligatory cat metaphor.
Yes.
So they kept blowing up.
Mm.
And actually, one of the explosions on the pad had killed a number of people. Now, in hindsight, looking back, I have a feeling that our CIA had a hand, because it wouldn't have been difficult at all to sabotage parts of the Soviet space program so that they literally could not make it there ahead of Kennedy's deadline for the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Remember, we were at war with the Soviet Union, 2 totally opposed political systems that were doing everything they could to win the hearts and minds of the uncommitted nations, the third world, the people looking for freedom or despotism, and whatever system worked, because their lives are so desperate. And most people on planet Earth still lead very desperate lives. So this was symbolic of a huge, which system will perform for humanity better.
Wow.
And we are there again. Right now, tonight on this planet, we are faced by this stark decision between freedom, liberty, democracy, and autocracy. And autocracy in the persona of China and the Soviet Union, now called Russia, they're making real play for the hearts and minds of the planet as to which direction politically, human beings are going to go into the rest of the 21st century. So these things are not just symbolic; they literally change people's hearts and minds and cause them to have allegiances that, were in many senses contradictory to the thoughts and perceptions they held just 2 days ago. So this was a real battle for the hearts and minds of the planet back during the Cold War. And I don't have a smidgen of evidence I can cite here this evening, but I have a feeling, given the consistency with which the Soviets had huge problems with the moon rocket, and the fact that they literally gave up tells me that they could not solve their technical problems faster than some outside agency created them. And that's where I really think that our CIA comes into being. And at some point, given that we now have kind of open access to a lot of the documentation from behind the Iron Curtain in those years, I'm sure we're going to find memos someday where the KGB says outright in memos that the CIA basically sabotaged the N1. We've come close. People like James Oberg, who was a big authority on the Soviet space program, has come very close in some of his writings and research and analysis. But there has been no outright smoking gun, and maybe for political reasons, given how Putin thinks that, we did him in, decades ago when the Cold War ended, and he's always carried the chip on his shoulder. Maybe those documents have quietly not been published because they would kind of add fuel to a very bad fire.
Ah, I see. Well, a couple things I wanted to add while I let you catch your breath. I didn't mention that I've been listening to you on the radio since I would say the early to mid 1990s, when you were on Coast to Coast AM with Art Bell. That show is still on the air, but it is now hosted by George Norrie. Art Bell, he retired and then he came back and he created a show for himself and asked you to do a follow-up show. And that's how your current radio show, The Other Side of Midnight, was created back in 2015. I was a huge fan of Art Bell and I miss him terribly, but I created this podcast in 2015 to coincide with the two of you. So you two started on July 20th, 2015, and I started a month later. But I also wanted to mention that you were working for CBS while in New York, while my uncle, he worked for CBS in New York City for over 30 years. You guys were there at the same time. And then,
oh my gosh.
Yeah. And then what
did he do?
He was an editor.
Oh, down in telecine, as they used to call it.
He worked in film. He was a film editor.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then my grandmother's, this is going to sound convoluted, but my grandmother's cousin, who she was very close to and like a sister, her husband.
Sorry, Laura.
That's okay.
I must have met him.
I asked him.
I was in and out of telecine because in those days you had these huge, they like took up a room, Ampex video tape recorders, but the only way you could get film, which was shot, because we didn't have ENG in those days, electronic news gathering. Everything was shot on 16 millimeter film, and then rushed to a lab to be developed, and then given to a courier, put on a 707, and sent back to New York, by air. And then a courier picked it up at Idlewild, later turned into JFK, raced into New York on a motorcycle. Delivered it to the bureau. It was looked at, reviewed, put into the Cronkite Evening News, and so it was a very elaborate. No satellites, no electronics, whatever. It was all film.
Yeah.
How did you get the film on the air? Well, you literally set up a projector in this set of rooms called telecine. Tele, like in television, cine, cinematic film, and you would aim the projector at a TV camera mounted on a bench. So it was projecting literally not onto a screen, but onto the faceplate of the TV tube, of the sensitive part of the camera, end to end. And it literally, sorry.
That's okay. Go ahead. Yeah. Wow.
It literally was.
Changed.
It was either broadcast live that way, which was dangerous because, the film could break, right? Or it was recorded onto videotape, big 2-inch Ampex reels that literally whirred, and you had to almost wear headphones. The sounds were so loud, and the fans to keep them cool, because everything was vacuum tubes in those days. no integrated circuits, no transistors. So the heat in the telecine rooms it was not trivial. And of course, air conditioning was in use, but it was a very different atmosphere. And I would obviously, so I was looking at film and video and whatever for the lunar stuff, I would go to telecine a lot. I must have met your uncle. I must have.
I'm sure. Yeah, I'm sure you did. And then I remember because I was living in New Jersey. I grew up in New Jersey, and he was living in New Jersey after a while when he had a family, and he would take the bus into work every day. But I remember, I don't know what year it was, hearing that this is when there was the big change, right? When everything went digital, and that his department went from 45 staff to 2. Yeah. And he made the cut. So he was one of the 2. And then they didn't, there came a point where he didn't have much to do. So I remember him saying that they would just kind of sit around all day. And at that point, there was just very little to do. So I don't know much more about it than that. But my other connection with you is that my grandmother, who was very close to her cousin, who was like a sister, her husband, they lived on Long Island. Her husband worked for Grumman.
Oh, at Bethpage.
Yeah. So those are my 2 connections. And then I mentioned that I have been listening to you on the radio since the 90s. And actually, so I mentioned your current show, but we'll get into that later. And I've filled in for you a couple times, and I've been a guest on your program. So I just want to say now to everybody, it airs live every Saturday and Sunday night. You can listen online at theothersideofmidnight.com. It is from midnight to 3 a.m. Eastern, which is 9 p.m. Pacific till midnight. And you have fascinating guests. I like actually the most when you talk and you tell your stories and you cover that's my favorite. And you cover what is going on currently in the news as far as space. But I'd like to back up and
we also cover a lot more.
Of course.
The last several programs, maybe going back to February, we've been focusing on Mars because of NASA landing the second rover, the big Perseverance rover, and the fact that in June, we're in June now, there's supposed to be this huge release from the Senate Intelligence Committee of the so-called UAP, Unidentified Aerial Phenomenon Report, better known to all of us as UFOs. The U.S. government is taking, finally, it's terribly seriously. There's political folks involved. There's major media. It's a watershed. So we've been focusing our weekends kind of on the confluence of these 2 parallel explorations of what's out there, the ET paradox, the extraterrestrial mysteries, the things we're never supposed to know. And we're in the middle of this shift, this huge political civilization shift, and I have no idea where it's going to come down. But I don't think we're in the Lucy in the football situation. I think this time it's for real. So the last several weeks we've been focusing more on space, but I have a lot of interest. I proudly say I'm a generalist. So I've had people from the arts, I've had people from Hollywood, I've had people, looking at weird political systems. I've had arcane experts on out of body experiences. I hate the term paranormal.
Yeah.
Because given the work on the physics, the hyperdimensional physics model that I've been working on for like 20, 30 years, nothing is abnormal if it can be documented that it takes place. What happens is that the CIA, our friends again at the CIA, they created an entire category of fake news decades ago, the National Enquirer. And they literally, out of Lantana, Florida, ran a whole bunch of these Enquirer clones that would have, like fake photographs on the front page, of Clinton standing, with an alien at the podium in the White House briefing room. Right. And you could see it was an obvious fake picture, but millions of people would buy this at the supermarket counter every week to catch up on the soap operas of the Kardashians. I'm flipping back and forth in time. What was going on politically, the three-headed baby that was born in Borneo. I mean, and the CIA created, which then morphed, of course, into Fox News, this whole cadre of fake nonsense, so people can't figure out what the hell is really going on. And it laid the groundwork now for this extraordinarily pernicious and ultimately deadly bifurcation of society, where we have almost equal halves of the culture. One half cannot talk to the other half because even if they're using the same language, they're not speaking to each other. They're not connecting. They're not resonating. They do not see reality, the same reality as reality. Right. And of course, that's the death of everything unless we can correct this. And to me, it's really at the level of biblical. Yeah. Because remember, there is this chapter in Genesis where God confuses their language, the whole Tower of Babel thing and all that, and they all go back to being separate nations. Well, it's the old divide and conquer. Who is trying to divide us on the eve of reconnecting with who we really are? And that's so many hours of programming, we don't begin to have time in the next hour or so to get into more than just the high points. But that's what the other side of midnight is trying to do, is to document as much reality, as much testable science, as much predictive political analysis about this transition as we can bring to bear with all kinds of very amazing guests, including I'm working very hard now to get Danny Sheehan, who is the attorney with the Christic Institute, who has been working in these vineyards for decades. He legally represents Stephen Greer, who's a major name in the UFO disclosure world, as well as the new kid on the block, Luis Elizondo, who is the kind of designated hitter from the Pentagon, starting with this front page story in December of 2017, when the New York Times broke the Nimitz, incidents, the fact that U.S. Navy pilots had chased and monitored and photographed with high technology for, the early parts of this century, obvious aircraft maneuvering at completely non-normal, non-rocket, non-jet speeds and acrobatics, plunging from 80,000 feet down to the deck of the ocean in a second. And no one could survive the G-forces, let alone have a power plant that can do that. And these things do not have wings. They don't have ailerons. They don't have elevators. They don't have anything sticking out. They're obviously, controlling gravity. Well, who on this planet do we know that can do that? And that opens up such a can of worms. So that's what I'm devoting the other side of midnight in the coming days and weeks to, because December to June now is the month. Toward the end of June, we're now told, when the Senate report on all of this bizarre aerial activity around the various aircraft carrier fleets that the U.S. has all around the world, two fleets in particular, one on the East Coast, one on the West Coast, is all going to come to a political head in Washington with this official report. And you can see the trend curves in all of the mainstream coverage, including major journalists who have, made their names and, as we used to say in the trade, made their bones covering the trenches, story after story after story over years and sometimes even decades. They're all now turning to writing about UFOs. It's bizarre. Ashley Parker, who is the Washington bureau chief for the Washington Post at the White House, she wrote an amazing overview piece on UFOs for the Washington Post just the other day. And one of my colleagues and friends and someone who's been involved in this disclosure movement for decades, Stephen Bassett, he's featured at the end of the piece written by Ashley Parker, who was a national name in terms of the politics of the White House. So the UFO so-called paranormal community has now completely smashed into the squeaky clean mainstream, you've got to be kidding, we're calling all this stuff paranormal, mainstream journalists, and I have no idea where it's going to come out, but it's not going to be trivial, and I think it's going to change, and I think in a positive way, if we do this correctly, the future fate and course of civilization. Nothing more, nothing less. It's kind of like when I first walked into CBS at 20-something and said, "Hi, I'm here to help you go to the moon."
Yeah. Yeah, I got that email just before we started recording from Stephen Bassett about being included in Parker's story. And I just want to back up a little bit. You mentioned Daniel Sheehan. I had Ralph Blumenthal on this show last week, and he was on to talk about his new biography of Dr. John Mack. And when Dr. Mack was being questioned by Harvard University, he hired Daniel Sheehan as legal representation.
Oh, that's right. I forgot that. Okay.
Yeah, so we discussed that a little bit. And Ralph Blumenthal was the co-author of that article that you just mentioned, the now famous December 2017 story in the New York Times, talking about these sightings that these Navy pilots are having while they're flying off their aircraft carrier. And you were describing, Richard, the movement of these unidentified aerial phenomena that we're all talking about. And I'd like to ask you what you think it is.
Well, this is part of a rising controversy within the so-called UFO community, because it's kind of like that line that I used in The Monuments of Mars when I was writing about artifacts on the planet, including a big one that looked like us, did not belong there, a human face on Mars. Are you kidding? Right. You know, the only outrageous writer who ever conceived of something like this was Ray Bradbury. Remember the end line in The Martian Chronicles where he is the kind of hero of the book, has taken his kids and they're surviving on Mars after a nuclear war on the Earth, and he points them to the waters of a canal. Back when Bradbury was writing this, you know, Mars canals were still in vogue, and he has them look at their reflections in the waters of the canal, and they said things like, "Daddy, where are the Martians?" Because in Bradbury's tales, there were old Martians still hanging around. And he points them down to the water and he says, "There, they are the Martians." And of course, the kids were looking at their own reflections. Yeah. So it was Bradbury's amazing. I mean, it turns out Bradbury was true. The Martians are us. And that's a very long, complicated story, which is not going to work itself out for years and years and years. But the entry point is there an extraterrestrial reality? Are there really folks out there? Are they really flying in extraordinary spaceships? And who are they? Are they aliens? Are they the bug-eyed monsters of the 1950s, grade B movies? Or are they something even more extraordinary, which would be relatives? Are they cousins? Do we have a human family in the galaxy, not just here on planet Earth? What's our relationship to the family, et cetera, et cetera? So when you ask me who are flying these incredible, obviously anti-gravity spacecraft, there's only three possibilities. Okay. Just three. The first is we're looking at a secret, high-level, ultra-deep state set of research and development craft of the so-called secret space program. And there's a lot of effort and documentation in that direction that the U.S. government is in fact working on this kind of stuff and has been since the 1920s. There's the work of Admiral T. Townsend Brown. There's a brilliant book covering all of this by my friend Dr. Paul LaViolette, who's been on the show many times. I think it's called the Anti-Gravity Handbook. Just Google, anti-gravity and Paul LaViolette, LAVIOLETTE, and you'll come up, and it's the book to buy in terms of the documented with memos and leaked documents of the secret U.S. efforts to control from the 1920s onward gravity and to create real anti-gravity spacecraft. So I know technologically that if there was enough money, and of course the government has all the money it wants, right? If it doesn't, it just prints more. So if you have the money and the time and the engineers and the proper physics, we humans could create what the Nimitz pilots reported seeing. The question, of course, then becomes not technical, but political. Would a top secret burn before reading component of the black ops, deep state program, R&D program, would it be parading what it's been doing in plain sight to the entire, fleet with all the radar and all the observers and all the pilots and, gun camera footage and all this FLIR and whatever? Would it be parading a top secret burn before reading program to where everybody could report it in the New York Times?
But are those classified missions that they're flying?
Whose are we talking about?
The David Fravor, let's say.
You mean the Navy pilots?
Yeah.
No,
Okay.
Those are just ordinary routine maneuvers.
Okay.
The military services, thank goodness, practice all the time. Practice. Because what happens when you practice enough times, when the real, what hits the rotating kitchen appliance, you don't think, you respond. It's an automatic reflex.
Yeah.
And that will save your life. So they want to get their pilots and their soldiers and their, fleet admirals and everybody involved in the Defense Department to the point where when shit happens, I guess we can say that, we're on cable.
Sure.
You do not think, you just respond. So they're drilling constantly. So these are just overflight drills with the fleet, takeoffs and landings, pinpoint exercises, navigation in the midst of everything failing around you. Every conceivable scenario is gamed out. So these guys and gals, because they're women pilots as well. In fact, one of them appeared on 60 Minutes the other night. They were doing the normal drill with the fleet off, I think it was the Nimitz off San Diego. Mm-hmm. And that's when this modern iteration, this has been happening much longer than the New York Times initial story in 2017 laid it out. But it's been happening regularly, and no one's talked about it because not only are they all told not to talk about it, but all the radar data, all the tapes, all the records of the plunge from 80,000 feet to the ocean deck in seconds, that's been taken away. That's been absconded with. So when people have tried to outside in the UFO community, go in with FOIA, there's nothing to find because it's all been erased, wiped. Buried under 15 layers of bureaucracy. So the turning point was something that could outmaneuver an F-18, outshoot it, outgun it, out-accelerate it, that could make turns that would smear human pilots into thin films on the inside of the cockpit because of the G-forces. That was performing right in front of them like it was showing off. Mm-hmm. So let's set aside, this is a big controversy now, let's set aside, is it our stuff? Because for a whole bunch of reasons, no, it's not our stuff. For one thing, why would we be parading our stuff that's top secret? I mean, the control of gravity is the control of everything. Why would we be laying that out there for what's the word I'm looking for? Unsanctioned eyes to see and witness. Mm-hmm. When we have millions of square miles of airspace, both on and off the planet, to test and perform and to check out this kind of technology where no one would ever know what was going on. It just doesn't make sense if you have a top secret program that you then parade it so everybody gets to notice it and see it, and it winds up on the front page of the New York Times. Makes no sense. So let's set that aside. It's not our stuff. So whose stuff else could it be? Well, the next layer is, could it be, nations? Could it be Russia? Could it be China? Could it be Iran? Could it be some secret cabal of nations that have, glommed together the technology to put together spacecraft that can perform all these maneuvers and have nothing better to do than to basically flaunt their stuff in front of the Sixth Fleet, in front of thousands of eyes and radars and all this, when they're trying to develop it in secret? Again, that makes no sense. If this was developed technology by Russia or China, let's just limit it to those two major planetary antagonists on Earth at the moment against Western democracies, against, what we stand for, we would be speaking Russian or Chinese, because this technology allows them to defeat us without firing a shot. It literally is that far ahead of any conventional rocket engines, jet engines, explosives, airfoils, Sidewinder missiles, Vulcan cannons, whatever. It can run rings around anything we can put in the air. And that's how you win battles. Now, why would someone be doing this? Well, if it was another nation that had developed this program, given that there seem to be a few of these, they're not millions or thousands, there's dozens of these craft that perform these maneuvers, sometimes only 2 or 3. And I remember in some of the reports that some of these pilots had really close encounters where the maneuvering spacecraft or aircraft, whatever it was, they're called Tic Tacs because they resemble the little, smooth white pellet of the candy that was released by the little dispenser you used to buy at the drugstore. These things are so maneuverable that some of them came within feet of the F-18s at hundreds of miles an hour, scaring the pilots to death because they had no control.
Well, do you consider that these are unmanned?
Doesn't matter.
Okay.
If they're a technology maneuvered by another nation state on Earth, then they're demonstrating a capability, manned or unmanned, drone or person, that can so outstrip what we can do that in any dogfights, in any real confrontation, we have no defense, zero defense. How do you defend against something which can go from 80,000 feet to the ocean deck in 1 second? 80,000 feet, 5,280 feet per mile. Divide, 5,280 into 80,000, and you wind up with moving tens of miles in a second. The accelerations, the velocities, the energy, the ability to stop on a dime, to not squish anything, all over the cabin. There's no way in a war you could confront that with an F-18. So someone is parading their abilities as a demonstration of power, as a demonstration of, look what we can do, sucker, you can't touch us. Is that another nation state? Well, unless they have battle fleets developed for deployment, if we really had intelligence that it could be traceable to Russia or China, then we have nuclear weapons and we would have to do something as a first strike, because otherwise they will take over the planet. There's nothing that could stop them, that could stand against them, because the way you do this, the way you control gravity in the hyperdimensional physics model, it gives you the control of everything else. It gives you control of time. It gives you control of beam weapons. It gives you control of force shields. It's literally a Star Trek technology, up to and including maybe even transporter technology, which means there would be nothing we could do, nothing, with 21st century clunky, jets and rockets and Sidewinder missiles. Come on.
Right.
So it's someone playing force games, and I don't think, because of the process of elimination, it's Russia or China. That leaves a final possibility that it's extraterrestrial. Now, like the old good news, bad news with the haystack story. You've heard that one, right?
No.
Oh, okay. A paratrooper. This is going to be a diversion, folks. Paratrooper jumping out of an airplane, okay? Fortunately, he's wearing a parachute.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, it doesn't work.
Mm-hmm.
Fortunately, he's wearing a backup parachute. Unfortunately, it doesn't work either. He's over a hayfield. Fortunately, he sees that he's coming down at a very high speed into a field where they've just piled up all the hay to be baled and whatever, and he sees that he can possibly land on one of the haystacks. Unfortunately, he doesn't land on the haystack. It's just
right.
Plus, minus,
okay.
plus. Well, the good news is the technology exists. The bad news is it's not in our hands. The good news is no one's done anything really catastrophic. Nobody's been killed. Nobody's been shot down. These have all been kind of like during the Cold War. Remember, we used to have what were called the Boomer Wars. You know about those, right?
No.
During the height of the Cold War, us and the Soviet Union used to play chicken under the ocean with submarines.
Oh.
Our big submarines are called boomers, the ones that carry the missiles that could obliterate Moscow and Stalingrad and whatever. Mm-hmm. And the Russians had killer attack submarines. And they would, The Hunt for Red October is a wonderful movie for showing how those killer hunter games used to take place. They would come within feet of each other, 1,000 feet down in the dark using only sonar. And it was intimidation. It was basically, my stuff is bigger than your stuff. And I'm replacing, the word stuff with other things.
Yeah.
So to me, what the Nimitz and the Roosevelt and the other pilots are reporting looks like somebody showing off their stuff and basically saying, you can't hold a candle to what we can do if we ever got serious. So then the question is, who would have that attitude? All right. If it's not a secret U.S. top deep state research effort, which makes zero sense, if it's not Russian or Chinese, pilots using this technology showing off, and of course, if they did, they'd be clobbered when they get back to Beijing or Moscow, because you don't do secret stuff in public. So that leaves us the ET scenario. But like the haystack, story, we've got two sets of possibilities. Either they're ET aliens, little green-eyed, bug-eyed monsters from Alpha Centauri that are here looking over the planet to invade. Okay. Being kind of quasi not serious. Or they're not aliens, but they're part of this extended human family I keep talking about that only look different because they live in a different planet or star system. But in fact, with this technology, they can come and go into the Earth sphere at any time, at any moment they want to. And one of those groups is showing off, is demonstrating they've got more cojones than the U.S. Navy because it's a show of force and it's part of a bigger geopolitical plan. And that brings us to my favorite model, which I'm going to talk extensively about on Saturday and Sunday with Steve and with Joe Bookman, and then on Sunday with Richard Grossinger, who was my original publisher on the Monuments of Mars, that we're looking at what we call the breakaways. The terrestrial humans, the Nazis, post-World War II, a la Richard Dolan's model, that took the top secret anti-gravity, the oil, ultimate free energy technologies that do all these magical Star Trek thingies, and they took it off the planet, and they've been developing a separate breakaway human Nazi civilization off planet somewhere in the solar system for these past 75, 76 years since the end of World War II. And they are now coming back wanting to occupy and conquer Earth. And their initial foray was to demonstrate for the U.S. Navy that we got nothing that can touch them if they really want to take over.
That this technology was developed off planet, and you said by humans.
No, it was developed on planet. If you look at the end of World War II, General Calmer, and you look at the works of colleagues of mine like Dr. Joseph Farrell, who's documented this with the help of some sources behind the former Iron Curtain. When the Iron Curtain fell in late 89, 89, 90s, whatever, a whole bunch of top secret memos and documents, part of the behind the Iron Curtain's communist treasure trove of documentation, came to light, became open source, became public. And there are researchers. There's one in Poland whose name escapes me, who Joseph has been working with very closely. And you find all kinds of incredible evidence that the Nazis literally had cracked the secret of anti-gravity, separate from the U.S. Navy work with T. Townsend Brown. And at the end of the war, a guy named Kamler, General Kamler, took this deep state black ops research division out of eastern Czechoslovakia, I think, is where they were based under a certain set of mountains there, and took them off planet, took the developing fledgling spacecraft and literally either went by way of the Antarctic bases to the moon or went to Mars or wherever they could basically create a new environment. And given the fact that we know there are ruins all over the solar system, that's our own work on ET archaeology, they didn't have to take and build stuff. They simply moved in, turned on the lights, and occupied what was already there.
Okay.
And they've had, 75, 80 years now to develop separately. So I'm looking at all these events reported in that first story in the New York Times, and I'm saying of all the likely gin joints in all the world, the Casablanca thing, which category of antagonists would be demonstrating, and we did another 19.5, would be demonstrating their super technological superiority over anything being fielded by the current governments of planet Earth? It would be the breakaways, who basically want to move in and take over Earth like the Nazis tried in World War II. Hitler tried a major, major gain for that philosophy, and he came very close to winning. And on the other side of the world, remember, the Japanese were also developing their A-bomb technology. We just beat them to it, and we've forced them into a standstill together with the Russians joining the war in the last few days. So history has been turned on very unusual events in the past. There's no reason why those events, won't continue to be unusual in the future. And I think that what we're seeing with the UAP, shall we say, antagonism, fits into the model of adversaries that are showing off their stuff. Two kids in a schoolyard, one bully and the other guy trying to defend, let's say a friend, and the bully is basically demonstrating that he's going to wipe the floor with the other kid if the other kid doesn't give in.
Now, I'm sure that some of our listeners are going to think that this sounds extraordinary, and it does. But
all I do is point you to the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, NBC, CBS, ABC, Fox News, Tucker Carlson, who else? Barack Obama, who came out just 2 days ago. I mean, we're looking at the political landscape from far left to far right. All are agreed. We now need to know what's going on because, in the words of Senator Mark Rubio, who's the one who was chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee when this report was commissioned, there's something invading our airspace that we can't control. We need to find out what it is because it could be a threat.
It could be a threat. I think that what the listeners might find extraordinary is this theory of the breakaway civilization, because that is not a generally known theory. It's highly unusual, and because I've been listening to you and listening to The Other Side of Midnight, and I'm familiar with Joseph Farrell's work and Richard Dolan's work, and for listeners, I will have everybody's name and websites in the show notes for this episode. So I guess I'm wondering where all of this fits in with your research. When did you first consider this? When did you first hear about this? And is it because it kind of fits into what you already know about what's happened on Mars and the moon, which we haven't really gotten to yet?
No, this is just, the kind of backstory.
Right.
We may have to do another one of these. Gosh.
Yes, I think so. Well, what happened, what I read in the intro was that you were part of the coverage of the Mariner 4 flyby of the planet Mars, which was back in 1965.
Right.
Is that when that all started for you?
No,
because that's before the Viking.
No.
Okay.
I was dumb and naive then as everybody else.
Okay.
I just thought, it was based on, anticipation of Mars. Was it a Llewellyn Mars? Were there canals? Was there vegetation?
Right.
Had there been an ancient civilization? We were so naive back then. So the Mariner 4, flyby of 65 was an opening for everybody into the real Mars. And of course, the huge disappointment was the scientific results from Mariner 4 said, there were no thoats, there were no green Martians, there were no canals. It was a rocky, cratered place, looked like it dead as a doornail, dead as the moon, and the atmosphere was 1/100th of the atmosphere that we're breathing right now, equivalent to, being found over the Earth at about 100,000 feet. So all of the dreams of, Edgar Rice Burroughs and Martian civilizations and the glittering crystal cities of Barsoom, all of that died with the data that came back in those hours in July of 1965 when Mariner 4 flew by Mars, 6,000 miles away, took 22 photographs, and reported on the atmosphere that there was, quoting Elton John, Mars was not the kind of place to raise your kids.
Right. Let's cut to 1976 and the Viking photos.
Oh, yeah. Gosh, that was an amazing morning. We had decided as a nation to, in 1976, the bicentennial year, remember the bicentennial? Remember the fleets? Remember all that wonderful celebratory, of this amazing experiment, which is still ongoing. We don't know how the ending is going to be written, but we can write the ending if we do it right. Anyway, 1976 is part of the huge bicentennial celebration. We reached out as a culture, and we sent 2 unmanned spacecraft, Viking 1 and Viking 2, to Mars. Actually, it was 2 fleets, because each Viking, as an orbiter, as a mothership, carried a lander. So there were really 4 spacecraft. So you had 2 orbiters circling Mars, looking down, taking pictures and other data. And then you landed 2 spacecraft, Viking 1 and Viking 2, thousands of miles apart on different parts of Mars to survey for the first time conditions on the surface. These were nuclear-powered spacecraft, so they lasted a very, very, very long time with their own internal nuclear power source. And they landed thousands of miles apart, and they took pictures, obviously, on landing. And the pictures looked so achingly familiar. I mean, I remember standing at the crack of dawn in the lobby at JPL with a whole bunch of other news people, including Carl Sagan. And we're watching on the big monitors that were hung all over JPL, in the cafeteria, in the offices, in the corridors, in the auditorium. You had these big, huge Conrack monitors, these monsters that if they fell on you, it would kill you. And they had them suspended on trunnions from the ceiling so they could be tilted and rotated. So wherever you were in the office or in the news area or whatever, you could see what was going on all over the lab, including data coming back from the Viking missions to Mars. So in the early dawn of that morning, like 5 or 6 a.m., the spacecraft on the 20th of July of 1976, Viking 1, had set down on the plains of Chryse, the Chryse Plains, as it's known in Latin. And a few minutes later, we'd gotten our first black and white images, first of the footpad, and then of the landscape as the camera literally line by line, because it was like an old-fashioned fax machine where the image came in not all at once, but literally line by line by line, and the picture built up, and it built up and it built up, and we saw this black and white, craggy desert, stark lighting, hint of some clouds, dark sky, bright sky toward the sun, crisp lander details, rocks, and it was all black and white, and it's wiping on the big screen, which is the center screen at JPL in the Von Karman Auditorium, and there's 15 to 2,000 people in the auditorium, most of them news people from all the American newspapers and networks and from all over the world. The BBC, the Japanese, the Koreans, the South Americans, everybody was there. I used to say that every 2 years when we went someplace, JPL would throw a kind of a Woodstock and everybody would come. Mm. It was such an amazing space party. Yeah. Because you'd see people that you hadn't seen in years, and you caught up on their lives and what they were doing, and you had this mission behind the scenes to kind of, be the glue that's strung day by day by day together, and you're seeing new things and you're seeing new amazing images. I mean, it was a heady time to be part of the NASA program. So there we are, all of us gathered in the Von Karman Auditorium on that early morning of July 20th, 1976, and I'm sitting literally between, on my left is Gene Roddenberry, my old friend and creator of Star Trek, and on my right is Eric Burgess, who was Arthur C. Clarke's old friend and co-founder with him of the British Interplanetary Society, and a whole bunch of other people that I knew. There were, for the New York Times, Walter Sullivan was there. He was a science writer for the New York Times. There were folks from other networks. There was Jules Bergman bustling around. There was what's his name? Hugh Downs from NBC, who was kind of like the long form, deep coverage guy for NBC. He used to host the Today Show, and they would give him these think pieces where he would do like an hour special on science and arcana of research and whatever. So he was, everybody who was anybody on television and in the media those days was there, because we were landing on Mars at the crack of dawn for the first time. And it was really amazing because later on, when Carl Sagan died, and remember there used to be a show, I think on A&E, called Biography?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
Remember? Okay. Well, I'm flipping back and forth. Many years later, when Carl Sagan died prematurely of an amazing runaway cancer that, frankly, I'm very suspicious of, Biography, like all the networks, like I participated in some when I was at CBS, we would do biography pieces. We called them bank pieces that would basically be a thumbnail biography of these famous people. So if they died, you didn't have to create a show from scratch. Okay. You simply put the tape on and ran the tape, and there was their biography of their accomplishments, their loves and lives, and the things they'd done, and why they were famous or infamous or whatever. So all networks used to do that. They still do that, and they're called bank pieces. Anyway, so Biography had done this on Sagan, and they ran the night he died his biography. And I remember I was in New York. My girlfriend was in the other room, and she came running in and she said, "You're on television. You're on television." I said, "What?" So I flipped on the TV, I think it was in the living room, and tuned to the same channel, and it was Biography running the biography of Carl Sagan, and there I was, a part of Carl Sagan's biography. Oh. And the film they had included, obviously, specifically by his command, his desire, because Carl was a very, very controlling person, and he would not have shot this and let them produce it without him monitoring every single frame. Uh-huh. Well, he was like that, okay? Yeah. That's how he created the amazing enfant terrible image of Carl Sagan, genius E.T. scientist, that kind of thing. There I am, and it's the photography, it's the film footage shot with me sitting in the front row at JPL the morning of Viking, with Roddenberry on my left and Eric Burgess on my right. And there I am in that horrible leisure suit holding a stupid handheld little tape recorder with this stupid grin on my face and awful long – I look horrible. The 70s were not good sartorially. We really dressed very, very badly. Gene was also wearing a leisure suit. If you ever have a leisure suit, go and burn it, please, please. Anyway, so there I am in the middle of Sagan's biography at the moment we land on Mars.
Oh, I didn't know this.
And it's part of his secret, Emily Dickinson between the lines. No, Hoagland's not crazy. There was a secret civilization on Mars that I, Carl Sagan, couldn't tell you about when I was alive. It was so Emily Dickinson because it was part of the Mars segment. And why would he put me in there? What's my claim to fame in terms of Mars? There's only one thing. I'm the guy who thinks and has documented the existence of a former set of amazing civilizations on the planet starting in when did I first do my first public thing on this? It was in the 1980s.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
83, somewhere around there.
Well, you were on Larry King in 1983, weren't you?
I think it was later. I think that was in the 90s. I think. Yeah, it was in the 1990s. That was the night I got the Angstrom Medal. We went directly from the ceremony in Washington over to the studio, and I spent a very agonizing half hour trying to get Larry King to believe any of this stuff, and he only began to believe it when I presented documents, papers, and he started looking at them and reading them, and it was toward the end of the segment. I think I had half an hour, and he totally turned around. He went from being incredibly skeptical to where he saw that NASA had actually been covering this stuff up. And I had documentation of the NASA cover-up of the monuments of Mars, and I was able to present it to the worldwide audience on Larry King. And it was, I think, sometime in the summer of 92, I think.
You know what? You're right. This was in the 90s. I just opened it up, and if you could hear that, it was me clicking. It is on YouTube. Again, I will have a link to the segment. Yes, I will have a link to it in the show notes. It aired on August 25th of 1993. Your entire segment is here on YouTube.
Wow.
Yep. So
see,
1993.
You have to all be very, very careful because things you have done decades past wind up on YouTube. Thank God. Right. I don't think I've done anything that was documented that I wouldn't be at least could say, yeah, that's me. I don't think. There could be surprises out there.
That's right. That's right. You never know. So I want the audience to know that these photos from the Viking mission to Mars, but I don't want this to slip through the cracks. You mentioned July 20th. So we landed on the moon on July 20th and we landed on Mars on July 20th?
Gosh, isn't that special?
And you started The Other Side of Midnight on July 20th. I just have to add that.
Well, Art and I did that deliberately.
Yeah, I knew that you did.
Because, and in fact, see, I didn't start out doing that when we're jumping around, folks. So you're going to have to play this a couple times, okay? Many, many years later, when I got kicked off of Coast by George through very bizarre reasons, I still to this day don't know why George turned from being my friend, and he demonstrably was both my friend and Robin's friend, very, very good friends. And he turned around and he just kicked me off Coast. And I think, frankly, it was a conspiracy. I think it was designed to cut me away from my national platform, which was Coast to Coast AM. And because we're getting to the end time where things were going to be meaningful. And if there are enemies out there, which I do have, remember they tried to kill me back in the 1998, 1999. Yeah. They tried to give me a heart attack, and Robin saved my life. If they really wanted to get rid of me because I would be an annoyance when the end game came around, getting rid of me on a national platform like Coast to Coast, which had 600 and some affiliates through Premiere, and when I would, talk on Art's show and then on George's show, I knew from sources that literally in certain NASA centers they would turn on Art's program and run my interview, my hours and hours on Art Bell live in the NASA Space Centers, so everybody at NASA could hear me talking about what they were covering up.
Wow. So
at the end point of this, which was in the 2015-14 timeframe, when we thought things were going to be really getting serious, Like the whole big discovery transition thing was supposed to take place, I believe now, based on some analysis, both of my own and by Bassett, that when Hillary was elected president, that's when this was all supposed to hit the fan. And someone in that time frame wanted to get rid of me, did not want me to be a national voice. So what's the quickest way to get rid of someone that you don't want to be a voice? You cut off their voice. You make it impossible for them to get airtime, to get national exposure. I mean, I used to be on CNN. I used to be on Fox. I used to do all those things.
Yep.
Suddenly, it all dried up, as if someone wanted to basically make me go away. And the most solid national connection I had, which was really international, and I have some stories of being overseas with Robin, and we would literally be recognized in amazing alien countries because I'd been on coast with art. How people recognized you by your voice when you're not on television, but they specifically said, "Oh, I listen to you all the time." I mean, Rob and I had several experiences like that in the Netherlands, in London, and I mean, so we had a literal world reach with that platform, and someone wanted to take it away because Hillary was supposed to be elected president, and the disclosure that we're seeing now was supposed to take place years ago, 5 years ago, and it got cut short because the guy named Trump, the former guy, got elected instead of Hillary and sent shockwaves through all of the careful disclosure plans that Podesta and others had created. And when you listen to my show on Saturday nights, we'll be reiterating some of this with Bassett, because I now think his model was correct, because it was in the same time frame that she was beginning to make kind of public rumblings about ufology and ETs and all that, that they stabbed me in the back, got rid of me on coast, and then Art said, "Would you like to do a show on my network?" which was Dark Matter. And he was launching in his 50 millionth comeback, Midnight in the Desert.
Yeah.
So he said, "What would I'd like to do?" He said, "I'd like to come on, and then I'll introduce you, and you will have a show after me." And he said, "You've got some think." Oh, I spent like a month. Robin and I spent, because Robin hated Art. Robin was not happy with how Art treated me in years past, and that's just, Robin liked some people, she didn't like other people. I always found that when push came to shove, Art was there. And in this case, he proved he was there, because he offered me a platform, again, under the coattails of his name. Remember, back then, Art Bell was a huge name. Even if he hadn't been on radio for a couple, 3 years, he was on Sirius Satellite. He was talking with ABC affiliates in Los Angeles. He was going to do this thing on the web, Midnight in the Desert. Crystal Gale's famous song that she wrote for him. Have you ever heard her song?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Oh, it's a wonderful song.
The theme song for that show. Yeah. And he co-wrote a book with Whitley Strieber, The Coming Global Superstorm. And years before, he had written a book called The Quickening.
Yeah, Robin and I attended the premiere in New York of The Coming Global Superstorm with Art and Ramona.
Cool.
So we had a lot of interesting adventures together, the four of us, while Ramona was still alive, and of course while Robin was. So he offered me this berth. Looking back now, I'm wondering if it all was just coincidence. Remember FDR? He said in politics there's no such thing as coincidence.
Yeah.
It's like when someone took a doorway away, and then someone else opened another doorway. I'm kind of wondering, was that just coincidence, or was there a higher level something going on? Anyway, that's when I created my own show, which I had been fighting for years about not doing. Because doing radio, even 2 days a week, it's a lot of work.
It is.
If you do it, I mean, you've done this podcast forever. Well, not quite forever, okay.
Well, I started when you guys started.
Yeah, well, and you know how much work it is.
Yeah.
And you don't do it live. You do all these things on tape, right?
Right, I do.
Doing live is so much different. It reminds me of that Bill O'Reilly. YouTube thingy where he, snaps at everybody and swears, we'll do it live. We'll do it live. Because they couldn't put a piece together, and he used a lot of profanity. And, people are running. Look, anything you've ever done in your life is going to wind up on YouTube. So for God's sake, don't do dumb, stupid things. Again, I don't think I've done any dumb and stupid things that were caught on camera, but you never know. So if you search me on Google, someday you may find something dumb and stupid I've done. Who knows? That could be an incentive for people to go and look for dumb and stupid things I've done. Anyway, so one doorway closes. Nuri acting bizarrely, because we were only talking about doing this special for the first flyby of the New Horizons mission to fly by Pluto.
Yep.
Discovered by my colleague Clive Tombaugh, that I actually got to meet at JPL. I got to meet the discoverer of Pluto and spent one gorgeous afternoon just sitting there in Von Karman, just chatting, just talking with John Everhart and a bunch of other journalists, about this is decades before, of course, the flyby mission of Pluto. And I was able to get on my show, on my special covering the flyby of Pluto, I was able to get Clyde's son.
Yes, I remember.
So I have him on my show, my Pluto special, which George kicked me off coast because for some reason he didn't want to do a couple little things I wanted to do. And he wound up in a bizarre fashion, which you never do. He wound up insulting me on the air as a guest. And that was my official separation from Coast. The doorway opens and Art says, would you like to do your own show on Dark Matter, my own network, following me? So Robin and I had long, long discussions. She ultimately said, well, it's you probably should do it. Because I didn't want to do full-time radio, and I started out doing it 5 days a week.
Yeah, you started off doing it during the week.
Insane. And I had a producer, but we had no money, and Robin had her own career, and she had her own show at that time, so she wasn't able to really help, and so it was incredibly. And the reason it was so stressful, and the reason I had never wanted to do it, is because what would happen to the research? Remember, we're the only folks looking seriously extraterrestrial archaeology. We're getting down to the end game where it's all going to fall out of Fibber McGee's closet. 99% of our audience have no idea what I just said.
No.
And I'm going to be tied up doing a radio show, producing it and hosting it and getting guests and doing vetting and making sure that crackpots don't show up that can't document. I don't care how far out what you say is, just have documentation. It's why I had this whole Corey Goode secret space program thing that some of my friends and colleagues have been doing, I think, is crapola. Because you can claim anything. Right. I mean, look at the mainstream political process now of the country. There's half the country that believe total lies just because someone in authority claimed it. And they're not looking at how do they figure it out. How do they look at evidence? They're simply going on someone's word and their inclination and their rancor and their attitude that we're put upon, that we're the beset generation and that we're, the people that have been, sinned against. So there's a huge amount of angst in the body politic right now based on zero evidence. Claims are not evidence. 62 court cases dismissed. That's evidence. Otherwise, you don't believe in the American Constitution. And I happen to think it's a pretty damn important document, and it's worked fairly well for the last 250-some years. So into this milieu, the end game, as I said earlier, I was offered this slot, my own show, to follow the Art Bell. And I thought, well, it's better than being nowhere. So I decided I would undertake this experiment, which was grueling. It was, frankly, I never want to live through those days again because it was an almost impossible job to put together a decent, professional, synoptic radio show that would be unique, that would cover unique stuff, that would be a meaningful contribution to the dialogue, that didn't kind of an outlet for ego. Believe me, I've done enough media over the last several decades that if I never saw another television camera or radio mic, it would be totally fine with me.
You've done a lot. When I was getting ready to do this episode with you, I found things that I had never seen before. And like I said, I've been listening to you for decades, and I saw things I couldn't believe. I thought, wow, Richard, you've done a lot. And I'd like to also add here that the entire archive of shows, because even though it was grueling for you, there were some excellent shows produced in the early days, as there are now. But if you join Club 19.5, and we're going to have to tell people what 19.5 and the significance of it is, because I squeezed you in between two. I usually record on Wednesdays. I squeezed you in so that this could be the episode between 19 and 20, so that this is episode 19.5. So I just want to let everybody know that the entire 6 years of archived shows of The Other Side of Midnight are available if you join Club 19.5. I think it's 33 cents a day. So it's $9.95 a month. And
well, if anybody likes Starbucks, just quit one Starbucks coffee per week and you can pay for the show and then some. So
there you go. And you'll have access to all of the shows with all of these fascinating guests. But like I said before,
there are now thousands of hours.
Yeah, thousands of hours.
I've spent thousands of hours in front of this microphone doing The Other Side of Midnight. So let me loop back.
Okay.
Because Art said, and again, the big thing with Robin was, are you going to work with Art Bell? He's such Robin did not like Art. And someday maybe I'll, document, some of the reasons why, because Robin had very, very good instincts. And the way Art left the air himself after I got on is very bizarre. And
it was
I've been trying to figure it out. And someday when I like documenting things. I don't like just claiming things. Mm-hmm. I like documentation. So when I put the rest of the documentation together, we may tell the untold story of what happened to Art, because I think that it might have been his invitation to me to have my own show that was a Kiss of Death for Art's show. I can't prove it yet, but I think they were connected given the bizarre things that happened behind the scenes. So anyway, the big discussion between Robin and me was, are you going to do this? And are you going to do it with Art? She said, no. And she finally came around. He had a conversation. He called her up and they had like a 2 or 3 hour conversation. I do not know what they talked about, but her attitude after that was, okay, this is something you probably should look into doing. So that was basically why I decided to do The Other Side of Midnight, which gets back to, how did it wind up being called The Other Side of Midnight? Well, remember, Art has his show, Midnight in the Desert. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking, okay, he wants me to follow him. Art and I, philosophically, except for, the subject we talked about, we really did not see eye to eye on almost anything. Politically, he was much more far right than I am. I had proposed that we do a show together on the whole concept of gun control, and he would bring his allies and I would bring my allies, and we would basically meld the two shows together from Midnight in the Desert all the way through to the wee hours of the morning. And, but at that time, gun control and gun issues and gun terrorism, was a very, very hot topic. Mm-hmm. It never happened because he literally could not see any benefit in airing, quote, The Other Side. But here I am to follow Bell, and I'm thinking, okay, what can I do? And I was thinking back to my early days at WTIC in Hartford, Connecticut. And remember, I did a lot of work with TIC, wound up doing the Mars special, which in '65 was nominated for a Peabody Award. The Peabody Awards in radio was like the highest. It's like the Oscars. Mm-hmm. So my show, my 5 hours, of which only a half hour is preserved because Dick Bertel literally edited down a half-hour synthesis of the 5 hours, and the rest is lost. They used the tape again, and got totally erased. So it's gone. But we do have half an hour of a sampling of what we did in that rather historic show the night that Mariner 4 flew by Mars. So I got to know, because of my entree into TIC, and I'd been a guest a lot with Bertel and some of the other guys. Back in those days, they would talk and they would play music. They would talk and play music. And some shows were, talk shows as a genre were not had not taken over radio at that time. There was a lot of, old style banter. There was morning drive time. There was evening drive time. There was, disc jockeys. There was one guy out of a local radio station down in Hartford called his air name was Sandy Beach, and he would run on weekends these Sandy Beach parties, and he would play music and he would talk about all kinds of things, and it was basically personalities in radio were personalities then. It wasn't canned automatic corporate stuff as it is now, where every station and every market is the same because they're all part of a syndicate. You can hear George driving across the southwestern deserts in the middle of the night, as Robin and I used to do when we were going to a conference, and we would drive because we wanted to take Morala with us to give her another new audience to get used to. She loved to be in front of audiences. She was such a people person, our little dog. Anyway, so I'm thinking what I'm going to call this show that's going to be on after art, Midnight in the Desert. And I remembered there was a guy that followed Bertel on WTIC, had the all-night show, and he called it The Other Side of the Day. And I'm thinking, and I thought, what if I called this show, which follows art, The Other Side of Midnight, which was a pun.
Right.
It was following art, but it was also everything art didn't want to talk about politically. I would be the other side of midnight because I was very much different than Art Bell. So that's how The Other Side of Midnight was born.
I love it. Great story. And you're still standing. So if we didn't...
We're in the end game, and I'm still alive, and I'm still here. And I just wish Robin was here.
For the audience, Art Bell passed away in 2018, and Richard's partner, Robin, Dr. Robin Falkov, she passed away in 2019. So it's been rough.
It's been awful.
Yeah, it's been pretty rough. So we miss them, and we dedicate this to them, and so they live on. Their work lives on. They will be remembered, and so we think of them and we hold them close in our hearts. So we must live on. We must move forward and carry the torch. So, Richard, you are. I promised that I was going to explain to the audience what 19.5 means.
Okay.
So let's go there.
Well, okay. I mean, we obviously haven't touched any of the Mars stuff. There's amazing new data. There are missions now that are sending back. The Chinese just landed an unmanned spacecraft on Mars and then have disappeared, which I think is not an accident. I think it's tied in directly with the huge geopolitical thing that's going on around, disclosure.
Okay.
The end game is now here. Trump is history. Biden is president. The disclosure format, program, political agenda, whatever you want to call it, is now moving on. That had to take a hiatus for those 4 years. So as one of my old Intel friends said, many, many years ago, he said, the art form, in terms of me being on coast and all that, he says, is to stay relevant so that when it's time,
I see,
you're there.
Mm-hmm.
Well, by hit or miss and because of Art and Robin and you and a bunch of other people, we're still here, and the end game is now unfolding, and it will involve not only things that go bump in the night, meaning UFOs, Tic Tacs, whatever, and who's driving, and what's really out there, and who's really flying them. And yes, there are real aliens, but I don't think that a lot of the folks that have been showing up are aliens. I think they're family, and that gets into the whole, back engineering of what we found on Mars, what we found on the moon, ancient archaeology, looking for the libraries. What is Perseverance's real mission? Why is the helicopter made the transition from a tech demo to an operational demo? What about the astonishing Sidonia-sized pyramids that are at the south end of Jezero crater, just a few miles away from Perseverance landed? Didn't hear about those, did you? Anyway, 19.5. As part of the last 30 or so years of doing this, I figured out that it's not really the ET civilizations out there, including our own stuff, that's important. It's the physics which has been revealed to us, that has been shown to us in the geometry of how all these structures were built and laid out on the various terrains. And one of the recurring themes were a set of numbers and geometries which ultimately resolved down to a simple geometric form called a tetrahedron, which is a four-pointed, four-sided pyramid, if you count what it sits on. In 2 dimensions, a tetrahedron is an equilateral triangle, with each of the angles being 60, 60, 60, and each of the sides being the same length. But in 3 dimensions, the first geometric form that you can form when you go from a point to a line to a 3-dimensional object, the first form you create is a tetrahedron. It turns out that the tetrahedral model, this geometric thing, is an excellent significator of this unseen physics which runs the entire universe, the kind of hidden physics that we have not been supposed to be allowed to really manipulate and see and work with, because it gives us the secret of anti-gravity, infinite, unlimited, environmentally compatible energy, unlimited lifespans, biology that fixes itself, the basically the cure-all for all diseases, life as it should be lived as opposed to life we're now living. And the secrets of this are all embodied in the anti-gravity movements of these strange vehicles being tracked as part of the Nimitz experience, the New York Times story, the pilot sitting there on 60 Minutes, and Ashley Parker writing for the Washington Post a feature story as head bureau chief of the the White House press corps there at the White House about UFOs. It's all part of the same, timey-wimey ball of wax, at the core of which is the fact that there are ruins out there. Ruins built not by aliens, not by strangers, but by our great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmothers and grandfathers. We are the Martians, and when I do the next show with Laura, we will very metonymically, in a narrative fashion, beginning, middle, and end, lay out the research into the monuments of Mars and what's on the moon and what's on Pluto and all the other places in the solar system which turn out to have ancient, stunning habitations and structures and archaeology that NASA and nobody else wants you to know about. And it's all going to fall out of that closet as soon as the Senate report acknowledges the reality that ETs and UFOs and the Earth as part of a much vaster sociological ecosystem of conscious beings in the galaxy all becomes a front page story on the New York Times and the Washington Post. And coming back to 19.5, if you take a tetrahedron and you spin it, it gives you 7 symmetry spins, 7 degrees of rotation that are symmetrical. If you put it in a spinning planet, it predicts where the energy that's spinning and processing stellar objects, stars, the sun, galaxies, planets like the Earth, like Mars, like Venus, like maybe even Pluto, which is where the energy that we don't understand where it's coming from could be coming from. It marks on their surfaces where the energy comes up, which is the touch points of a tetrahedron in a sphere above and below the equatorial equator of a rotating object. So the 19.5 applies to 19.5 degrees north or 19.5 degrees south in a 360 coordinate system, which is not arbitrary. It's part of the physics. It's why it's been handed down to us from the Sumerians and Babylonians through 6,000 years. It's the keys to the functioning of the real universe. And that number, 19.5, as I say in one of my intros on the show, is the most exclusive club in the world because it's access to the most exclusive information, which has been kept from us for literally thousands of years, and which now, because of the politic machinations in Washington, D.C., and a Senate report in the hands of Senator Rubio, seems at the end of this month, the end of June, about to be reborn. And if that's all going to happen, and it moves in the trend curve that I am projecting, astonishing things are going to happen to make all of this other reality suddenly be very, very real to an awful lot of people who have no idea that any of this has been going on. And that's where we introduce part 2.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Richard. Please visit the website Speaking of Jung, that's JUNG.com, for more information on everything that was discussed in this episode. There you will also find all of the previous episodes of this podcast, which are available to stream or to download for free. This episode is also available on Apple and Google Podcasts, Spotify, and Amazon Music. And it will be available next week on our YouTube channel, Jungian Laura. You can also listen to this episode on your Amazon Echo device, simply by saying ALEXA, play Speaking of Jung on Apple Podcasts. Just be sure to pronounce Jung with a hard J. So with very special thanks to my guest, Richard C. Hoagland, I'm Laura London, and you've been listening to a very special quarantine edition of Speaking of Jung.
Just